Have you ever watched a proud man bow his head? Not from guilt, but from hunger and humiliation? Have you ever seen freedom itself treated like a crime? They called us rebels. They called us traitors to the crown. But what we wanted was dignity. Nothing more, nothing less. In the markets of Boston, English merchants laughed as poor colonists begged for fair prices. On the docks, red-coated officers beat young men for speaking of liberty. And in the taverns, whispers of rebellion were silenced. With threats and chains, we were farmers, writers, mothers, and children, a people learning to breathe under the weight of empire. Each humiliation lit another spark. Each injustice carved deeper the word freedom into our hearts. Have you ever felt powerless? Stay with me until the end. What you are about to hear may shock you, because sometimes the smallest voice can shake an empire, and even ink, black, fragile ink, can bleed louder than gunfire. Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed. Give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story. Nathaniel's candle flickered beside the window, the weak flame trembling as if sharing his own fear. Outside, the boots of English soldiers echoed through the cobblestone streets, a reminder that silence was safer than truth. But Nathaniel was done with silence. He wrote as if every word were a blade, carving through the chains that bound his people. Each stroke of ink became an act of defiance, a whisper of liberty against the roar of empire. He was no soldier, no man of war. His hands were soft from parchment, not from gunpowder. Yet his heart carried the same fire as any patriot who had ever lifted a rifle for freedom. The townsfolk mocked him. Words can't stop bullets, they said. Ink can't feed the hungry. But Nathaniel only smiled with that quiet stubbornness of men who already know their fate. Then let them hang the truth, he murmured. It will still be spoken. Each dawn he left his small attic room to sell his pamphlets, thin papers soaked in courage. He placed them discreetly on tavern tables under sacks of grain inside the worn hands of fishermen. And always, always he felt the gaze of the redcoats upon him. One day, a British officer tore a pamphlet in half before his eyes. "You think this will free you?" the officer sneered. "You'll die a beggar before you die a hero." Nathaniel met his eyes and whispered, "Better a beggar in liberty than a servant in gold." That night, he returned home to find his room ransacked, papers scattered, ink spilled like blood across the floor. His manuscript was gone. The truth he had written, stolen by those who feared it most. He fell to his knees, trembling not from despair but from resolve. "They can burn the words," he said through gritted teeth, "but not the voice that writes them." Outside, the city simmered with tension. Farmers refused to pay the crown's taxes. Women hid messages in loaves of bread. Children carried letters beneath their coats. The spirit of rebellion crept through the alleys like smoke, unseen but unstoppable. And in the midst of it all, Nathaniel's name began to spread in secret. Some called him the Phantom Quill. Others said he was already dead, a ghost writing from the grave. But those who knew the truth kept it hidden, for his survival meant hope. Every pamphlet became more daring. He wrote not just of injustice, but of transformation, the awakening of a people betrayed too long. He wrote of dignity and sacrifice, of the price every soul must pay for independence. He wrote of betrayal, not from enemies across the sea, but from neighbors who traded their honor for comfort. His words were no longer mere ink. They were torches in the dark. As the British tightened their grip on Boston, Nathaniel's steps grew heavier. Hunger gnawed at him. Fear lingered in every shadow. Yet when he held his pen, all that vanished. He felt the pulse of something greater, a nation being born in whispers and courage. And though muskets gleamed and gallows waited, he knew his weapon was already loaded with truth. One stormy night, a cloaked stranger knocked at his door. Rain dripped from the man's hat as he whispered, "They know who you are." Nathaniel's eyes didn't flinch. "Then it's time they know what I've written." The stranger handed him a sealed letter, stamped not with the mark of the crown, but with a crude emblem of a rising sun. "Your words have reached further than you think," he said, "but so have their eyes." Thunder rumbled. The candle trembled. And in that moment, Nathaniel Graves understood his struggle was no longer his own. The fight for liberty had begun to breathe through every beating heart of Boston. The tavern fell silent, the air thick with ale, smoke, and humiliation. Nathaniel froze, his trembling fingers clutching at the empty space where his parchment had been. Lord Reginald Whitmore stood before him, his jeweled ring glinting in the dim light as he tore the pages apart. "Freedom?" the noble mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. "A word for beggars who mistake defiance for dignity." Laughter erupted from the English officers at his side, cruel and sharp as bayonets. Each sound was an insult, each smirk a wound deeper than any blade could carve. Nathaniel's cheeks burned. Around him, the colonists, farmers, laborers, widows with tired eyes sat silent, heads bowed. They had lived too long under disgrace to risk another public beating, but in that silence something stirred. The shame that had chained them began to twist into anger. Whitmore smirked, savoring the power. "You speak of liberty," he said, stepping closer. "Yet you kneel before your betters every day. You'll die still slaves, begging for crumbs from England's table." He flung the torn parchment to the ground, its fragments landing at Nathaniel's feet like the remains of a dream. For a moment, Nathaniel could not speak. The words that had once come easily now felt heavy, trapped behind the weight of humiliation. But then, slowly, he raised his eyes. His voice came low, steady, almost whispering, yet it carried through the tavern like a storm ready to break. "We kneel because you hold the sword," he said. "But the day we stand, the world will remember our names." The room went still again. Even Whitmore's grin faltered, if only for a heartbeat. "Is that a threat?" the noble hissed. "No," Nathaniel replied. "It's a promise." Whitmore's hand struck him across the face. The sound echoed. Blood filled Nathaniel's mouth, the metallic taste of defiance. "Arrest him," the Lord ordered. 2 soldiers advanced, but no one moved to help. Only the eyes of the colonists followed as Nathaniel was dragged toward the door, his torn words scattered like ashes across the floor. "Let all of Boston see what becomes of rebellion," Whitmore declared, his voice triumphant. "Hang the pamphleteer by his pride." They forced Nathaniel through the streets, his wrists bound, his face swollen. Children watched from windows. Mothers wept. An old man whispered a prayer. Every step became a lesson in degradation. Every jeer from the soldiers, a reminder of how low the crown believed the colonists had fallen. Yet beneath that shame, a fire burned. Not just in Nathaniel, in everyone who saw him walk in chains. For if this was the price of dignity, perhaps it was worth paying. They brought him to the square. A wooden platform stood waiting, built not for death, but for spectacle, a theater of humiliation. Whitmore addressed the crowd with theatrical cruelty. "Behold the voice of your so-called liberty," he shouted. A fool who thought his scribbles could defy an empire. He ripped one of Nathaniel's pages and read aloud mockingly, "Freedom belongs to the soul, not the sword." The crowd murmured. Some laughed nervously, others turned their faces away. Nathaniel lifted his head, blood on his lips, and spoke through it. "And the soul," he said, "will outlive your empire." A hush fell. Whitmore's face twisted with rage. He struck Nathaniel again, but this time the laughter didn't follow. Only the wind answered, carrying the torn pieces of parchment into the crowd. A young boy caught one, clutching it to his chest. A woman bent down and picked up another, hiding it beneath her shawl. One by one, silent hands began gathering the fragments. And Whitmore, drunk on power, didn't see that what he tried to destroy was already spreading, through whispers, through courage, through memory. When the soldiers released him, broken but unbowed, Nathaniel stumbled. Through the alleys of Boston, rain began to fall, washing the blood from his face, but not from his resolve. In the reflection of a puddle, he saw not a defeated man, but a beginning. The birth of rebellion, written in suffering and pride. He understood then that humiliation could forge strength, that dignity was not taken, but revealed in pain. The journey toward independence had already begun, and its path would be paved not with comfort, but with sacrifice. Somewhere in the dark, a candle flickered in another window, someone else writing, someone else daring to believe. Nathaniel smiled faintly through the rain, his spirit unbroken. The empire had wounded him, but could not silence him. Tomorrow he would write again. The slap cracked through the cold air like a gunshot. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Nathaniel's cheek burned with the sting, but the greater pain was the laughter that followed, coarse, pitiless, echoing off the tavern walls like a sentence from God himself. Lord Reginald Whitmore, in his velvet coat and smug grin, dangled the blood-stained gloves as though he'd just killed a rat. A bastard without nation or cause. He spat, too low to serve, too proud to obey. The English officers howled with delight. Even some of the colonists forced nervous smiles, their fear disguised as mockery. Nathaniel stood motionless. His breath came shallow, his hands trembling at his sides. Beneath his boots, his papers lay trampled in the mud. The words he had written for liberty, now stained and torn beneath the heels of men who believed they owned the world. One of the officers pressed a boot down on a fragment that read, "Dignity belongs to all men." The leather smeared it into the earth. "There," the soldier sneered. "That's your dignity." The humiliation was total. He wanted to shout, to strike back, to reclaim even a shred of pride. But the weight of every eye held him down. The poor farmers in the crowd turned away, ashamed not of him, but of themselves. They had all felt the same degradation. They had all been forced to swallow their rage and call it survival. Nathaniel raised his eyes slowly, meeting Whitmore's gaze. Behind the noble's smirk he saw fear, not of the man before him, but of the truth he represented. "Your empire stands on the backs of those you've broken," Nathaniel said, voice trembling but clear. "But broken men can still rise." Whitmore's laughter faltered. He turned to the soldiers. "Teach this dreamer what rebellion costs." They shoved Nathaniel into the mud, pressing his face down until he tasted the bitterness of earth. His chest ached, his pride shattered, yet somewhere deep inside a voice whispered that this moment mattered. That humiliation, when endured with faith, could turn into fire. When they finally released him, he staggered to his knees. Blood mixed with rain, forming rivers through the dirt. He gathered the torn fragments of his writings, his fingers numb. Each word ruined, each phrase mutilated, and yet as he looked closer, he saw that one line had survived untouched. "The soul cannot be conquered." He pressed it to his heart, trembling with fury and revelation. Perhaps that was the hidden truth of his suffering, that dignity was not a gift from kings, but a decision carved from pain. Whitmore turned to leave, waving his gloved hand dismissively. "Remember your place, colonial rat," he sneered. "There will never be a nation born of your kind." Nathaniel rose, his voice hoarse. "Then you will never understand what a nation truly is." His words hung in the air, heavier than any chain. The noble hesitated, his arrogance cracking for the briefest instant. But the moment passed, and he strode away through the jeering crowd, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the rain. Around him, faces turned, silent, ashamed, awakened. A woman wept quietly. A child reached out, handing him one of his muddy pages. The gesture pierced deeper than any wound. Nathaniel looked at the boy and saw not pity but hope. That night Boston slept under a restless sky. Yet in its silence something had changed. The whispers of independence grew louder. Farmers who had bowed their heads began to speak of defiance. Soldiers began to question their orders. The humiliation of one man had become the spark of many. Nathaniel sat by the dying embers of his candle, pressing the surviving scrap of his writing against the table. His hands were swollen, his face bruised, but his eyes burned with purpose. He knew now that his journey was not to escape disgrace, but to transform it, to turn shame into rebellion, degradation into destiny. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor. The storm was coming, and with it, the reckoning that would decide whether a people born in chains could rise as free men. The night was black as judgment. Rain whispered through the alley, mixing with the acrid smoke that curled from the ruins of Nathaniel's printing shed. The smell of burning paper clung to the air, a scent of death, not of bodies, but of truth. Flames licked the edges of shattered wood, devouring words that had once carried the dreams of a people. Soldiers in red stood nearby, their laughter coarse and hollow, like hyenas at a grave. Their boots crushed the last fragments of ink and parchment, leaving only ashes behind. Nathaniel knelt among them, his hands trembling as he reached for what remained. A single half-burned manuscript, edges glowing red like a dying heart. He pressed it to his chest, his breath ragged. The rain hissed against the fire, turning smoke into mist, and for a moment the world felt empty, as if even God had turned away. "So this is how you kill an idea," one of the soldiers sneered. "You burn it before it learns to speak." They turned their backs, leaving him in the ruin of everything he had built. But even in their contempt, they did not understand. Ideas do not burn, they rise. Nathaniel's tears cut lines through the soot on his face. He stared at the ashes, at the fragments of words scattered like bones. Liberty, honor, truth. Each one seemed alive, whispering to him from the smoke. He thought of the faces that had gathered in the tavern, the hands that had reached for his pamphlets, the eyes of that boy who had handed him the torn page. They were watching still. They were waiting. His humiliation had been their shame too, but their silence had ended the moment his words took flame. What burned tonight was not defeat. It was transformation. From the shadows a woman appeared, her dress soaked, her voice trembling. "Nathaniel," she whispered, "they said you were dead." He looked up, barely recognizing her. Mary Ellis, the widow of a militiaman hanged for treason. Her husband had once carried his writings across the countryside, hiding them beneath sacks of flour. Now her eyes glowed with the same fire he saw in his own heart. "You cannot stop now," she said. "They think fear will silence us, but fear is all they have left." He rose slowly, his knees weak, his body shaking from exhaustion. Around him, the remains of his press smoldered like the aftermath of a battle. The wooden type blocks, his weapons of rebellion, lay shattered. Yet as he touched the charred metal letters, he realized something. They were scorched, but not destroyed. He picked one up, the letter F, still warm, still whole. Freedom. A word too strong for fire. From that night on, he wandered the narrow streets like a ghost, carrying what was left of his writings beneath his coat. He rewrote what the flames had devoured, his ink now mixed with ashes, his words heavier with truth. Every alley became his workshop, every whispered conversation his printing press. Farmers hid his pages in their barns. Mothers sewed his sentences into blankets. Sailors carried them across the harbor. His rebellion no longer needed a roof. It lived in every beating heart that refused submission. Yet Whitmore's vengeance was not done. The noble's fury deepened as rumors spread of the firequill, the mysterious writer whose words rose from the ashes. Nathaniel's defiance had humiliated him before the garrison, and now humiliation turned to obsession. Rewards were offered for information. Neighbors betrayed neighbors for a coin. The city became a trap of fear, betrayal, and whispered courage. Nathaniel knew the noose was tightening, but each time he felt despair clawing at him, he remembered the sound of Whitmore's glove against his cheek, and how that shame had become the seed of resistance. If liberty was to be born, it would be born through pain. He no longer feared sacrifice. He was becoming it. One night he stood by the harbor, watching the lanterns of British ships reflected on the water like bleeding stars. He opened the half-burned manuscript and read it softly to the wind. The words, though torn and blackened, still carried the pulse of life. A nation is not born from kings, but from courage. He folded the page carefully and placed it inside his coat. Behind him, footsteps echoed, the sound of authority, the weight of consequence. Nathaniel did not turn. The rain began again, washing the last traces of ash from his hands. Somewhere deep within, he felt the certainty of what must come, the moment when a single act could ignite everything. Comment: I stand with the Patriots. The fog swallowed the city like a gravicloth. Nathaniel walked through it with his collar raised, the dim glow of the harbor fading behind him. Boston, once his home, now a wound he could not look at without bleeding. Each step away felt like betrayal and rebirth at once. The cobblestones were slick with rain, the air heavy with silence. Only the echo of his own boots followed him, like a ghost reminding him of what he had lost. Behind him, redcoats patrolled the docks, their torches flickering like eyes of the empire itself. He did not look back. He had nothing left there but ashes. By dawn, the sea mist had carried him far into the countryside. He reached a forgotten village hidden among the pines, a place too poor for British taxes, too remote for soldiers to care. The people there lived with quiet dignity, their faces carved by years of labor and silence. They did not ask who he was, only saw the weariness in his eyes, and gave him shelter. In a small cabin at the edge of the forest, Nathaniel began again. His printing press was gone, his name hunted, yet his words refused to die. He carved them, with trembling hands, one line at a time, by candlelight. Each night, as the wind howled through the cracks, he wrote. His ink was mixed with soot, his quills dull from use. Yet the words came stronger than before, forged from pain, tempered by shame. He wrote of the nameless farmers who fed armies without eating themselves, of mothers burying sons beneath the flags of kings who never knew their names. He wrote of betrayal and transformation, of the revelation that true independence was not granted but born in the souls of the humiliated. Every page became an act of defiance, a prayer disguised as rebellion. He hid the manuscripts beneath the floorboards, fearing discovery, yet knowing discovery was inevitable. The fear became part of the ritual. Each time he placed a finished page in its hiding place, he whispered a prayer, not for vengeance, but for strength. "Let my words outlive me," he murmured, eyes on the flickering flame. "Let them reach those who still believe." The candle's light trembled like his faith, but it did not go out. The villagers began to suspect his secret. They saw the glow in his window through the nights, the smudges of ink on his hands. One evening, an old farmer knocked at his door. "We've heard your voice before," the man said quietly. "We read it in Boston before they burned it." Nathaniel froze, then nodded. The old man's eyes glistened. "You're the writer," he whispered. "It's the one who made us remember who we were." He placed a small loaf of bread on the table and left without another word. Nathaniel sat in the silence, trembling, not from fear, but from something heavier. Hope. Weeks turned to months. The British raids spread deeper into the countryside, searching for dissidents. Rumors carried Whitmore's name, his cruelty growing, his thirst for revenge unrelenting. Villages were burned, and anyone caught with forbidden writings faced the whip or the gallows. Nathaniel knew his time was thinning, but he also knew that his pages were no longer just his own. Copies of his words, smuggled by farmers and fishermen, had reached the hearts of men who were ready to fight. The rebellion was no longer whispered. It was breathing. One night, as the snow fell in silence, Nathaniel heard hooves in the distance. He extinguished his candle and knelt by the floorboards, his fingers brushing the cold wood beneath which his work slept. The sound grew closer. Riders, perhaps soldiers. He could feel the pulse of danger like a heartbeat under the earth. He closed his eyes, whispering again, not for vengeance, for strength. The door rattled under the force of a fist. Then another. The voice outside was harsh, commanding. English. "Open, in the name of the crown." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He stood, looking at the dying embers of his candle, then at the floor that held his life's purpose. He understood what he must do. Some truths cannot be hidden forever. Some must be carried by sacrifice. The pounding grew louder. The window shook, and as the latch began to splinter, Nathaniel took a deep breath, feeling both terror and peace. His journey had led him here, to the edge between silence and revelation. What waited beyond that door would decide not his fate, but the soul of his cause. Years had passed since the night Nathaniel vanished into the fog, yet his words refused to die. They drifted through the colonies like smoke from a sacred fire, carried in whispers, hidden in coat linings, passed from hand to trembling hand. In the taverns of fishermen, on the porches of farmers, in the camps of weary militiamen, the words appeared without name or origin. They spoke of courage, of unity, of the divine right of man to stand against tyranny. They spoke of dignity rising from degradation. They spoke of liberty as something holy, worth more than breath itself. No one knew the author. Some said he was a preacher in hiding. Others swore he had been executed, and his ghost now wrote from beyond the grave. But the truth walked among them, older, thinner, marked by the years, yet burning with the same unyielding fire. Nathaniel Graves lived in the shadows, watching his words awaken a nation that no longer recognized him. He did not seek recognition. He sought transformation. Every time he heard his sentences repeated by men who had never met him, he felt something shift inside. A revelation that sacrifice was not measured by glory, but by endurance. The humiliation he had once suffered had become the soil from which rebellion now bloomed. The disgrace that had nearly destroyed him had turned into a weapon sharper than any sword. His journey was no longer about vengeance. It was about inheritance, leaving behind a voice that would outlast his body. The British officers called the unknown author the prophet of treason. Bounties were posted in every town. Soldiers raided homes searching for forbidden writings. Men were whipped for reading aloud the words Nathaniel had bled to create. But for every pamphlet burned, 3 more appeared. Every arrest only deepened the hunger for independence. And somewhere in the chaos, Lord Whitmore, older now, consumed by pride and failure, grew obsessed once again. He could not bear the idea that a colonial ghost defied his rule. He wanted the writer's name. He wanted his humiliation complete. Across the countryside, small bands of farmers began to gather in secret, reading the anonymous messages by firelight. "If there is no dignity under kings," one letter declared, "then let us be kings of our own souls." They read those lines and felt something ancient, awakened the conviction that even the poorest man carried within him a fragment of divine power. That rebellion was not sin, but salvation. The writings had become scripture for the oppressed. Nathaniel wandered from village to village, carrying new pages wrapped beneath his coat. He slept in barns, prayed in silence, and watched as boys too young to shave took oaths to fight for a freedom they had never known. He saw widows smuggling messages in loaves of bread, preachers weaving rebellion into sermons. His words had escaped him, belonging now to a movement he could no longer control. And yet, in that loss, he found peace. For liberty, once spoken, cannot be contained. Still, there were nights when the loneliness cut deep. He would sit by the edge of the forest, the candle's flame trembling, and wonder if his struggle had meaning beyond suffering. Was this truly divine justice, or just another man's delusion dressed in poetry? But then, from the distance, he would hear a worker humming a line from one of his writings, not knowing who had written it, but believing it as truth. That was enough. Rumors spread that the British were preparing mass arrests, that Whitmore himself had returned to Boston to crush the rebellion at its root. The Empire was afraid, and Nathaniel understood that fear meant they had already begun to lose. He gathered his final pages, written in his fragile hand, sealed them inside a wooden box, and buried them beneath the roots of an old elm. Not to hide them, but to plant them, because words, like seeds, grow stronger in the dark. As the first gunshots of resistance echoed miles away, the wind carried the faint scent of smoke, not of burning shame this time, but of awakening. The colonies were changing. A storm was rising, vast and irreversible. Nathaniel watched from afar, his candle flickering one last time, knowing that his voice had become the breath of a people ready to fight for their own rebirth. Lord Reginald Whitmore stood before the council, his voice sharp as the edge of a blade. The years had turned his arrogance into bitterness, his laughter into venom. "There is a serpent among us," he declared, striking the table with his ringed hand. "A rebel writer poisoning the minds of these peasants." His words spread faster than fire, faster than the gallows can silence. The room of officers and merchants murmured in agreement. They feared the writings, the invisible army of sentences that crossed borders without permission, that lit a dangerous hope in hearts long bowed by chains. "Find him," Whitmore ordered, his eyes gleaming with the cold light of vengeance. "Drag him from whatever hole he hides in. I will see him broken before the sun rises again." What he didn't know, what pride refused to let him imagine, was that the man he hunted was the same one he had once struck, before the jeering crowd. Nathaniel Graves, the colonial rat who had knelt in the mud, had become the voice that now haunted the empire. Whitmore had tried to bury him in humiliation, but from that degradation had risen a ghost far more dangerous than any soldier. In the countryside, the search began. British patrols scoured villages, their boots heavy with contempt. They stormed homes, overturned tables, tore through humble belongings, dragging men into the streets for questioning. Poor farmers stood with their heads bowed, enduring insult after insult to protect a truth they didn't even know. Women were struck for refusing to speak, elders humiliated for refusing to betray their sons. The empire's cruelty no longer inspired obedience, it sowed rage. Each act of degradation only deepened the people's resolve. Nathaniel watched it all from the shadows, hidden beneath the hood of a worn cloak. He moved through fields and forests like a wraith, listening to the whispers of rebellion that his own pen had sown. At night he wrote by the dim light of stolen candles, his fingers shaking with exhaustion and fever. His words had become his only weapon, his only comfort, his only confession. Yet with every new page, he felt the weight of sacrifice pressing closer. He knew Whitmore's net was tightening. The question was not if they would find him, but when. Meanwhile, Whitmore's obsession grew. He ordered public punishments for those found with rebel writings: flogging, imprisonment, exile. Let their screams be the ink that warns the rest, he told his captains. But fear, once powerful, began to lose its grip. The people no longer bowed, they endured. In the taverns they whispered the words that had once been printed in secret: "The soul cannot be conquered." Every repetition was an act of defiance, a silent battle cry. Nathaniel's heart ached at the cost. Each rumor of a hanging, each mother's cry in the night, felt like a wound carved into his own flesh. Yet he could not stop. He was bound to the journey he had begun. One man against an empire, a voice against an ocean of silence. "If they wish to find me," he wrote one night, "they need only listen, for I am in every word they fear." In Boston, Whitmore sat in his grand chamber, surrounded by maps and reports. His hands trembled as he held one of the confiscated pamphlets. The writing was familiar, the rhythm, the conviction, the fury controlled by faith. Something deep within him stirred, a memory buried beneath years of arrogance. He remembered the tavern, the slap, the man's burning eyes. For the first time, doubt entered his heart. Could it be him? The nameless writer, the rebel voice, could it truly be the one he had humiliated so long ago? But before he could answer the question, a messenger burst through the door, breathless. "My lord," he said, "another pamphlet has appeared. Not in Boston this time, but in your own district. Signed only with the words, 'A voice among chains.'" Whitmore's face turned pale. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something darker, the dread of unfinished retribution. He stood slowly, gripping the paper so hard it tore between his fingers. "Then the ghost still breathes," he whispered, "and I will be the one to silence him, far beyond the city walls." In the silence of a winter night, Nathaniel looked up from his writing. He felt it, the presence of his enemy, the shadow that had followed him through every humiliation and every act of defiance. The time for words alone was ending. The journey toward revelation was near. The storm that had once whispered now roared. Across the colonies, men who had been silent began to speak with Nathaniel's words on their tongues. "Freedom is the breath of the soul," they repeated, their voices trembling at first, then hardening into conviction. His phrases spread through taverns, over campfires, and across frost-covered fields. The very lines he had written in exile became the hymn of rebellion, binding the hearts of farmers, blacksmiths, and soldiers alike. What began as ink had turned into blood, the lifeblood of a nation awakening from humiliation. The British called it sedition. The colonists called it truth. The once muted cries for dignity now thundered against the walls of empire. In Boston, in Philadelphia, in the smallest fishing towns, the people rose from their knees. They no longer begged. They demanded. Muskets were polished, oaths were sworn, and for the first time, men looked their oppressors in the eyes without fear. The rebellion had found its voice, and that voice belonged to a writer no one could kill. Nathaniel wandered among them, unseen, listening as his words lived beyond him. In a tavern one night, he heard a young soldier recite his line by heart, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Freedom," the boy said, "is the breath of the soul." The crowd repeated it in unison, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel felt tears not of sorrow, but of revelation. His disgrace had become their strength. His silence had turned into their thunder. He had written for truth, and truth had risen armed. But victory carried its own cost. The redcoats struck back with merciless precision. Villages were burned, families shattered, and hope tested by fire. The Crown's officers mocked the rebels, calling them beggars dreaming of thrones. Yet each act of cruelty only fed the rebellion's flame. From ashes came courage, from suffering came unity, and from humiliation came purpose. Lord Whitmore watched it unfold from his grand chamber, his pride rotting into obsession. Reports piled on his desk, captured rebels quoting lines he had once dismissed as scribbles of a fool. He stared at one parchment, trembling. "Freedom is the breath of the soul." The handwriting, familiar, deliberate, pierced through years of denial. He saw again the young man in the tavern, the one he had slapped in contempt, the bastard without nation or cause. The thought clawed at him. Could it truly be the same man who now moved the colonies like a prophet of vengeance? The realization filled him not with guilt, but with rage. I made him, he muttered to himself. I forged him in disgrace. I will unmake him in chains. While Whitmore plotted his revenge, Nathaniel felt the walls of destiny closing around him. The rebellion was no longer a dream whispered in shadows. It had become a storm that demanded sacrifice. He had given his words, his peace, his name. But something deeper stirred within him. The revelation that liberty demands more than ink. It asks for blood. He walked through the rebel camps, silent among the men who now fought under the banner his quill had inspired. They greeted him as one of their own, not knowing the author who had written their courage into existence stood among them. One night, under a red moon, he stood by a field of militia, training in the dark. The sound of boots and rifles echoed across the hills. He thought of every humiliation endured, every insult swallowed, every page burned, all leading to this. The transformation was complete. The writer who once believed words alone could conquer tyranny now saw the truth. Words were the spark, but men were the fire, and the fire was spreading. In the distance, the church bells tolled. The colonies were on the edge of open war. Nathaniel turned toward the sound, his coat heavy with the cold and the weight of his choices. He knew Whitmore was coming. He knew that one confrontation remained, not just between two men, but between the voice of conscience and the hand of empire. His journey had been written in shame and sacrifice, but the final page was still blank. He lifted his eyes to the horizon, where smoke and dawn mingled, and whispered to the wind, "Let them come. The pen has done its duty. Now the soul must stand." The war swallowed everything: names, faces, prayers. Men who had once bowed to redcoats now stood with rifles in trembling hands, their eyes fierce with the memory of every insult endured. The colonies burned, yet from those flames came something sacred. Each village razed gave rise to another oath, another vow whispered into the smoke: liberty or death. And among those who fought, Nathaniel's words marched beside them. Crumpled pages, torn and bloodstained, carried in pockets over hearts that refused to yield. His ink had become their armor, his humiliation their rallying cry. Lord Reginald Whitmore met his end not in grandeur but in chaos. The proud magistrate who once spoke of dominion and order now bled into the mud of a nameless battlefield. The roar of musket fire drowned his last command. He fell among his own men, his velvet cloak soaked in rain and dust. As his vision dimmed, the world mocked him with irony, for the very soldiers striking him down shouted the same words he had once spat upon: freedom for all men. He died never knowing that the rebel voice he hunted had outlived him, that his cruelty had carved the foundation of a legend. While Whitmore's name sank into oblivion, Nathaniel's lived on without ever being spoken aloud. His final years passed like a shadow, moving from camp to camp, helping to print secret proclamations, mending the hands of men too tired to write. He no longer sought recognition, he sought continuation. Each word he had ever written now belonged to the people, no longer his alone. His rebellion had transcended the man. The ink spilled in shame that day in the tavern had turned to bloodlines running through a generation ready to defy kings. When the first American flag rose over the smoke of victory, few knew of the writer who had helped breathe it into existence. Yet his spirit lingered in every shout for independence, in every sermon, in every trembling hand that signed the declaration of a new world. The humiliation he once endured had not been in vain. It had been the crucible from which dignity was reborn. What the empire tried to erase had instead written the very soul of a nation. Years later, children grew up hearing tales of the nameless writer whose words had lit the hearts of men. Some said he died a martyr. Others claimed he vanished into the wilderness to find peace. But his writings, smuggled through generations, became sacred relics. Farmers recited them beside their fields. Soldiers carried them into battle. Widows whispered them over the graves of husbands who had fallen for liberty. Every drop of ink, every phrase, born from degradation, had become a testament, proof that even in defeat a single voice can awaken eternity. In his final days, Nathaniel sat beneath an old elm, the same tree under which he had once buried his manuscripts. Time had withered his body, but not his conviction. Around him, the land breathed with newfound independence, the echo of drums replaced by the hum of rebuilding. He smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the dawn of a free nation. He had seen the worst of men, their greed, their cruelty, their betrayal, yet he had also seen the best: sacrifice, courage, transformation. He whispered one last prayer, not to be remembered, but to remain within the spirit of his people. "Let them never forget," he murmured, "that liberty is born from pain and guarded by truth." The wind carried his words through the trees, across fields once soaked in blood. They would outlive monuments, outlive kings, outlive empires, and somewhere, far from the noise of history, the ghost of a writer smiled, his pen finally at rest, knowing that the ink he once spilled in humiliation had become the lifeblood of freedom itself. The echoes of war faded into silence, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder, earth, and remembrance. The fields where men had fallen were now quiet, but the soil still carried their voices, whispers of courage, of pain, of a promise kept